Hello everyone, my name is Ben Mitchell, a librarian at Thompson Rivers University and Kamloops, British Columbia, the lands of the Secwepemc people. Today I would like to talk to you about neurodivergent wellness as quality of life, community, and autonomy in academic libraries. A bit of a preamble, positioning myself. I was diagnosed with CPTSD in 2016, identified as autistic, and I likely have several undiagnosed learning disabilities, which I'm still trying to sort out. Growing up, my parents believed that admitting you were disabled was admitting defeat, so then that became my problem to deal with later in life. Another thing I always like to say in these talks, neurodiversity is bigger than trauma, autism, and ADHD, but these positions tend to be best represented in the discussions, and this talk is no different. These are the things I know best, just for myself and my social circles. I'd also like to mention there are some trigger warnings to this talk, including ableism, a mention of Nazis, eugenics, and suicide, because the language of wellness hides a lot of really intense health concerns and societal concerns, which we're going to have to unpack if we want to actually address the problems, the root of problems that we're facing. So with that said, for those of you who don't know, what is neurodiversity? It's been gaining a lot of popularity in recent years, but it was actually coined in 1998 in a thesis by Australian sociologist Judy Singer, who reasoned that just as biodiversity is a measure of ecological richness, neurodiversity reflects the range of ways brains and nervous systems can differ from person to person, and the cultural and social meaning we give to such differences. Someone whose neurological arrangement differs from the average is often described as neurodivergent, and a person can be born neurodivergent or become so later in life through illness or accident. And this concept of emergent neurodivergence is particularly relevant to us because trauma does change the brain. Trauma changes how your body regulates at a basic level. It changes how your attention functions. It changes how your memory works. And this is relevant to us because, I mean, as this talk mentioned, we are not okay. Library worker trauma before and during COVID-19 and what happens after. This talk is available free on YouTube. I recommend you check it out if you're concerned about the health of library workers, particularly in a public library setting. But across the board, almost everyone's experiencing trauma, and trauma isn't just like a made-up thing. It's your body reacting. It's as real as anaphylactic shock, and it can be just as fatal. So it's something to take seriously, and it's something that we increasingly need to incorporate into our understanding of providing library services and being humans in the world these days, honestly. So let's talk a little bit about the social model of disability. The social model of disability is often juxtaposed to the medical model of disability. And in the simplified form, right, the medical model states that basically illness and disability are something that's contained within a single individual, right? That there's something wrong with them, there's something that needs to be fixed or intervened in to bring them back to a quote unquote normal or average state of being, which is considered the optimal state of existence. Now, this is contrasted to the social model of disability, which does distinguish, importantly, between core impairments inherent to medicalized conditions, as certain things that folks with certain disabilities can't do, but also then separates out the concept of disability as actually those things which are caused by societal barriers, right? There's so many ways in which the difficulty disabled people have in navigating the world aren't intrinsic to their experience, but are part of how our society relates to people who are different, right? A common example that's used is glasses. We don't think of needing glasses as a disability generally in our society, but that's because of the ubiquity of glasses, of an accessibility technology, right? Disability advocates tend to say that, like, if we had a fully accessible society, so many things we consider to be disabilities would be intrinsically less disabling. And so the neurodiversity movement itself, again, just mentioning Stephen Kapp's discussion here, begins with its goal as the quality of life of neurodivergent people, which includes but surpasses adaptive functioning, for example, self-determination and rights, well-being, social relationships and inclusion, and personal development, and works backwards from there to address the individual and social factors that interact to produce disability. And because of this, right, wellness itself is political, and it's a communal or society phenomenon, emergent phenomenon. particularly in the context of, capitalism, right? But modern work is injuring and disabling. This goes beyond, the more conventional, like industrial accidents and workplace accidents, to the various ways in which the norms of modern work, professionalism, interviews, and precarity are themselves disabling, and particularly so for disabled people. Right? Precarity is antithetical to all of those things I just mentioned Cap talking about. So I would like to argue today that if you're not looking into the political dimensions of neurodiversity, you're not really understanding what your neurodivergent students and colleagues are experiencing on a daily basis, the world in which we live. So before I talk much about the specific context of libraries, I'd like to give you some broader context to the things that autistic people go through on a daily basis and the larger kind of worldview that makes that possible. So I sometimes say, disabled people were precarious before it was cool. It was never cool. Precarity is never cool. But this quotation from Devin Price in his book, Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity, really unpacks all of the challenges that autistic people face when looking for work and maintaining work. And again, I would strongly encourage you, if you only read one book about autism and neurodiversity, I'd encourage you to read more, but if you only read one, read Dr. Devin Price's new book. And in talking about disability in society more broadly, I mean, I have personal experience with this, right? One example that is will stick with in my mind forever, really, is this one time I was being introduced to a new workplace. I was being shown around, and we were going to offices and all that sort of thing. We walked past one person who we said hello to, but they didn't say anything back to us and walked by. And when that person got out of earshot, my employer turned to me and just kind of under their breath was like, "Oh, that's so-and-so, don't mind them. They're a little on the spectrum." Really hard worker, though. Now, there's a lot of things to unpack there, right? There's a lot of things to unpack there. First of all, they didn't realize I was autistic, right? Because autistic people are different. You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Some recent studies indicate that, in terms of neuronal connections, autistic people can be more different from each other than we are from the neurotypical baseline. So that's one thing. You don't know who's neurodivergent and who's not just by looking at us necessarily. Though we, do have certain vibes. But also, right, this doesn't reassure me. The sense that I will only be accepted in the workplace as long as I work harder than everyone else is profoundly anxiety inducing. It's not reassuring. I'm weird. I can't help being weird. And knowing that my weirdness will only be accepted if I'm, a good worker is terrifying, quite frankly. And this connects in a lot of ways to the history of autism and why your neurodivergent colleagues might be dealing with even more anxiety than everyone else is dealing with these days. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of Dr. Hans Asperger. One of the reasons why Asperger's is no longer there's a lot of reasons why Asperger's is no longer a diagnosis. But one of them was because Asperger was straight up a Nazi. He did have some fondness for some of the autistic children that he worked with, calling them his little professors. But ultimately, he was still part of a process of trying to figure out which autistic kids could still serve the Reich, who had some sort of special ability that could be put to use for the purposes of Nazi capitalism, right? And Action T4, right? So he was actually actively involved in this process whereby deciding which kids got to live and which kids were sent to die for being, quote unquote, too disabled. So this is a long history. Right? And it's not even just something that's in the past. If you're at all involved in the disability rights movement in Canada in the past few months, it's become very much more publicized. You might be aware of the context of medically assisted aid in dying, how recently the legislation has changed such that it's a lot easier to get medically assisted aid in dying than it is to actually get help if you're a disabled person. Stories of people who seek out, several people have already, committed suicide this way, not because, and they specifically said this, right, in interviews and stuff before their deaths, not because they wanted to die, but because there was no way to live in this society as a disabled person, that they couldn't get access to accessible housing and accommodations. They couldn't get what they needed to live. That's not the same thing as dying with dignity. Arguably, this is really the pinnacle of neoliberal eugenics, right? It's the illusion of choice that, like, oh, you could have a whole bunch of options, the marketplace of ideas, but really you're being funneled into a very particular outcome. And in this case, that outcome is death. And I think it's quite telling, right, that part of the decision to expand medical assisted aid in dying was a cost benefit decision. It was a financial decision. The government decided it would save money if more people were killed than were given medical and social supports. So that's the world we live in right now. It's quite upsetting, and it's something that's in the back of some of your disabled colleagues' minds as they struggle to find work in this precarious, challenging nightmarescape of neoliberal capitalism. And this is where we get to the topic of cognitive marginalization and epistemic injustices. Really, what these things are epistemic injustices are, like who gets to speak for themselves. An epistemic injustice is someone not being able to speak for themselves and their own experience. And I should stress, this isn't unique to the autistic or neurodivergent or disabled experience. It's across the board in systems of oppression. Some recent examples I can think of is, within Indigenous communities, right? Who gets to be an expert on Indigenous peoples, right? If, a white anthropologist, in a university, can make a career in a way that an Indigenous anthropologist working on the same topics will struggle. This is the thing. If you've done any reading in Indigenous studies, if you follow any major Indigenous academics, this is an issue within Indigenous spaces, and it's the same issue, or at least similar, within neurodivergent spaces. Right? We don't get to speak for ourselves. We're not considered experts. We're often the subject, or the object of study, rather than a subject of study or understanding. And because of this form of epistemic injustice, overwhelmingly, a lot of the medical literature focuses on a pathologizing view of autism from the outside, right? Historically, neurodivergent, particularly autistic people, were described as having reduced empathy, when again, that's just manifestly wrong. Overwhelmingly, autistic people, as I mentioned before, we are the outliers. We have extremes. We have different kinds of empathy. We struggle with some forms of empathy, and we're hyper empathetic in other ways. It varies considerably from person to person. We're not just borderline psychopaths, which, I mean, the concept of psychopathy itself needs to be unpacked, but there's just a whole bunch of issues with that kind of medicalized language and how it feeds into popular discourses around what autism is and isn't, right? This clip right here, or this section here from salon.com, right? Now the QAnon shaman wants to use autism as an excuse. Hell no. I don't know exactly if the QAnon shaman himself wanted to use this, but I know lawyers historically have tried to push this. If you actually read what the QAnon shaman's lawyer said about him, it's incredibly ableist. It's a gross screed. He talks about us as being short busters and stuff. And again, this is not to excuse the action of the coup attempt people, right? This is just to say that there's a long history of, legal experts trying to use autism as an excuse to get their clients out of facing the consequences of their actions. This was also used in the case of the Toronto van attack, which this was also used in the case of Gamergate, being like, oh, the autism made me do it. And this is incredibly dangerous for autistic people, right? Like, autism doesn't make us raging misogynist. Autism doesn't make us, the kind of racist and all sorts of things. That's its own thing. White supremacy is part of racism. Misogyny and is part of that. That's not intrinsic to the autistic experience. Another thing that's been said about us, is that autistic people have no theory of mind, that we can't, imagine what other people are thinking, or that other people have an interior world. This has increasingly been proven to be absolutely wrong. In fact, if anything, there's a double empathy problem, that we just have very different ways of existing in the world. And while we can have a harder time necessarily understanding what a neurotypical or allistic person is thinking, someone who isn't autistic, we have a much easier time, on average, saying what another neurodivergent or autistic person is thinking or feeling. And that's not across the board, again, because some autistic people and some traumatized people do experience a phenomenon called alexithymia, where we have a harder time actually sorting out and identifying our own feelings, which can make it a bit harder to identify and sort out the feelings of others. But again, that's not across the board. And one of the worst kind of well, not the worst, they're all bad, but one of the worst contemporary theories is the fact from Sacha Baron Cohen, who is actually the brother of Simon Baron Cohen of Borat fame, who hypothesized that autistic people have an extreme male brain, right? That is all about facts and logic and categories, and doesn't have time for any of those namby-pamby female brain things like, empathy and community and compassion. I should just stress that that doesn't help anyone. It's a bad theory. It should have gone away a long time ago. That's not how brains work. That's not how society works. But it's still sometimes present in the discourse. Simon Baron-Cohen is still a prominent autism researcher, so he's kind of slightly distanced himself from it in recent years, but it's still circulating. And even when we're not, because of this outsider view, right, even when we're not identified as being kind of like, borderline psychopaths, we have the other extreme, right? We can't win for losing. This recent study from 2020, right, actually pathologizes autistic integrity and honesty, right? In this study, ASD individuals, or folks who are autistic, unlike healthy control subjects, right, so as we're already saying they're sick, blurred the distinction between private and public conditions while making moral decisions. What they're saying there is that on average in their study, autistic people were more likely to do the right thing, even if they knew that they would personally benefit and wouldn't get caught if they did the wrong thing. So this is pathologizing our honesty. It's described as a behavioral rigidity, right? Now I should stress, autistic people aren't, also perfect angels either, but we do tend to want to be internally consistent to our own value system, much more directly, arguably, than an holistic population. Doesn't mean we're better. If someone can have a moral worldview that is still abhorrent, but they want to be internally consistent to it. But still, on average, this study found that autistic people are more likely to do the right thing because it was the right thing, and then goes to pathologize that because it's just viewed as anything that's different about autistic people is part of the quote unquote sickness. So this is why, when we talk about epistemic injustices, in library land, we do tend to talk about what is expertise? What is the role of expertise in society? How is it arrived at? What does it mean? The concept of expertise is political. And increasingly, right, within neurodivergent spaces, we are unpacking what it means to be an expert in autism and in neurodiversity concepts. Right, so this is again, CAP contributed to this article. Whose expertise is it? Evidence for autistic adults as critical autism experts. I hope I've shown or convinced you a little bit already that the medical literature surrounding autism oftentimes is deeply, deeply misguided and harmful. Conversely, autistic people who have the experience of being autistic, who might not have even graduated high school, can be very cogent and savvy, observers of their own experiences. Like, we can be experts on ourselves because we have a whole lifetime of experiences to draw from, in a way that allistic or non-autistic medical experts don't have. We know what it feels like to be autistic from the inside, right? We are also more vested in protecting and preserving our lives than people who study us. So that's something to consider as well when you're thinking about curating, neurodiversity LibGuides and those sorts of things. That what is expertise? This also applies whether you're studying any kind of marginalized community, really, right? I mean, the ways in which we think about double-blind peer review, right? It's not like it's a bad thing, but it comes from a very particular place. It privileges a certain kind of lived experience at its core. So let's enter library land, shall we? One question is, are there more of us in libraries? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that for the past 30 years or more, guidance texts for autistic individuals looking for work have suggested librarianship as a good profession for people who are autistic. So let's talk a little bit about the state of the field more broadly. If you want kind of just a very quick but still somewhat problematic overview, I would highly recommend Academic Libraries and Autism Spectrum Disorder, What Do We Know? By Gerard Shia and Sebastian Derry. It's a reasonably solid survey of the literature that does exist, but it also emphasizes that's not a lot. It offers some helpful suggestions for students, but I still wouldn't say this is an ideal text. It still leans towards a medical model, even as it says that librarians need to listen to autistic people more, and more autistic librarians need to feel safe being out in their workspaces. Now, this is one text, Supporting Students on the Autism Spectrum, a Practical Guide for Academic Libraries. Now, I have some apologies to the organizers of the Ocular Conference. It was an amazing conference. I loved it. I looked up some of the texts you suggested that we purchase in relationship to the conference, and I had some complicated big feelings about them. This text, full disclosure, I didn't actually get all the way through this text. I was getting really frustrated with it. It may be well-intentioned, but there's a lot of issues with it as well. It uses person-first language, like it describes people as being with autism, and it uses functional labels as defaults. It indicates that it's aware that there's some debate and discussion around those terms, and it says it's not pathologizing, but at every opportunity, it uses pathologizing language. It sides against autistic self-advocates in favor of a medicalized paradigm. It uses profoundly othering language in its analysis. It's assuming that its reader themselves isn't autistic, or, and that's an issue. So like, again, consider looking at this text. It definitely has some helpful stuff in it, but if it's the only thing you read about the needs of autistic students, you're going to get a kind of skewed experience, I would argue. Broader and more interesting text is Miranda Dube and Carrie Wade's LIS Interrupted, Intersections of Mental Illness and Library Work. Now, I should stress that autism isn't a mental illness, though a lot of us experience mental illness. It is a developmental disability. But this text really is really good at presenting own voice librarian stories from, the bipolar experience, anxiety, ADHD, autism, trauma, OCD, all sorts of things. It's a really rich and diverse collection of essays within this text. Though I think it's also quite telling that the autistic authors, several of them specifically say they don't feel safe using their own names while writing about these subjects, that they feel the stigma is still too great and it is a danger to them to be public. So think about that when you think about like how open and accepting librarianship can be. It's still not across the board the case. A few others, these are mentioned in some of the other texts. Emily Lawrence's Loud Hands in the Library is an own voice narrative that is short but helpful overview. Alice Eng interviews Charlie Remy in Neurodiversity in the Library, One Librarian's Experience, which is a personal narrative, but also like focuses on, just what kind of literature is available for actually like practicing librarians who are also autistic. And another recent one, which is pretty solid, is from Zachary Tumlin. This is a quiet library, except when it's not, on the lack of neurodiversity awareness in librarianship, which again is like a kind of like combination of personal narrative on autism and music, which is kind of interesting, as well as a bit of a literature review and a brief history of neurodiversity as a concept. And that's the bulk. There's not really a lot of literature out there, and there's certainly far fewer bits of literature from the, like, own voice narratives, right? We stress own voice narratives within the material, particularly in public libraries, and the material that we want to share for our patrons. But what about within librarianship itself? What about within academic libraries, right? So a few things to like potentially go from here. I think across the board, we really have to start with our own labor conditions if we want to have the power to really show up for our communities, right? Yeah, I'm talking about precarity here. We need to have more meetings like last month's Ocula conference. That was amazing. We need to keep some of our virtual options. That's usually, not all across the board, but usually a much better option for various forms of neurodivergence. We have to think about the politics of capitalist barriers to accessing information, right? Well, how does executive dysfunction, which is common in trauma, autism, ADHD, and a slew of experiences relating to paywalls and multi-step authentication and all the barriers to access that are put up in order to control information when what we want to do is share it, right? We need to think more about how library worker representation matters to student outcomes, right? And that's across the board, not just neurodivergent folks, but Black folks, Indigenous folks, Asian folks, trans folks, what have you. And we really need to think about how to make education more accessible to non-speaking autistics, because they often get left out of these discussions because the hierarchy of ableism is usually more skewed against them. Invite them into spaces. That's definitely another important thing to think about. So here's just a list of sources. I'd also recommend checking out the hashtag Actually Autistic Guide to Advocacy, just for kind of a broader overview of the Actually Autistic kind of movement. And this is my face again. Thank you kindly for listening to me. Again, my name is Ben Mitchell. You can reach me at bemitchell@tru.ca, Twitter @library_Ben, Tumblr @libraryben, and you can see our Twitch TV project at the TRU Library. Thank you kindly again for coming out, and I hope the rest of the conference goes glowingly for you. Cheers.